Hey, what's up? You want to learn about music? Do you want to learn about Valhalla Room? Valhalla Room, it's the most amazing reverb on the planet. It really is. For me, it's my workhorse. I don't know what I would do without it. I think if people told me that I didn't know anything about reverb, I'd say, well, I know the best reverb. I own the best reverb, and I know guys that own lots of reverbs, and I'm one of those guys, so I can tell you somewhat full-heartedly that Valhalla Room is probably the best reverb. Is it the best sounding in all scenarios? No, but what it's best at is simplicity and usability and effectivability. It's just awesome. It's awesome in all these things. So we've got a synth here. I'm going to show you. I'm going to go one by one. I'm going to explain these parameters so that you can get an idea of how it works. And then I'm going to give you some kind of real world situations and kind of frameworks to keep in your mind when you think about how to mix with reverb. I guess this is kind of like another reverb tutorial, but this one's more focused on Valhalla. So let's start with our dry sound and our basic, kick pattern. Love it. Love that you can't hear that kick, but we're not doing that. So the first thing you have in a reverb is your mix. Your mix controls the balance between the dry, unaffected signal, the signal without reverb on it, and how much of the signal you're getting with reverb on it. So if we turn the mix all the way down and gradually pull it up, just notice how the sound goes into a room. We gotta enable the reverb first. So at 100%, all you're getting is just the reverb itself, nothing else. Now, pre-delay in a reverb is the time it takes between when you hear the original sound and when you hear the reverb finally come in. It's best to test this out on a kick, on anything with a sharp transient and a delay after that. So I'll give you an example. What we'll do is we'll loop this section. We have Valhalla Room here, turn the mix down a little bit. And if I turn the pre-delay to 200 milliseconds, that means from the time that we hear the kick, it'll take 200 milliseconds, 221.6 milliseconds, to hear the reverb. It'll basically sound like a delay or an echo. Pretty cool. Now, if I turn the pre-delay all the way down, you get this. If like I'm making like tribal music. Like weird tribal music. All right, cool. So after that, what you can do is, so it's your pre-delay, then you have your decay. Now, I'm going to be upfront about this. The most important parameters in any reverb are your mix, your decay, and your high cut. If you don't know what the hell to do with pre-delay, just make sure you're not at 0, and make sure you're somewhere between 0 and 20 milliseconds just to be safe. The safest place is 0 and 10 milliseconds. So we're going to move on to decay. Oh, by the way, with pre-delay, let's give you some tricks. So pre-delay is essentially the distance between the source, which is like, so if you imagine that you have a vocalist and it's dry and recorded, and you want to place them in a reverb, what the pre-delay will essentially simulate is how far that singer is from the back walls of the room. The further he is away from the back walls of the room, the longer that pre-delay is. And the reason for that is because that pre-delay is the time it takes for his voice to travel from where he is all the way back to the back wall and then come back to your ears. So that's what pre-delay achieves. It achieves that effect, though like 9 times out of 10, I'm not thinking of it in that way. I'm thinking of pre-delay in terms of like, how much of a time, how much delay do I want between the original sound and the delay? Different sounds require different pre-delays to sound good. That's just the way it works. Like for example, I'll give you this bass line here. So let's Let's shorten that decay so it's just a little bit tighter. Haven't gotten to decay yet, but decay is how long it takes for the reverb to fade out. The shorter the decay, the smaller the reverb sounds. The longer the decay, the bigger the reverb sounds. Really remember that. The longer the decay, the bigger the reverb is perceived. The shorter the decay, the smaller the room. Okay, so going back to pre-delay, basically like with sounds that are super fast and like chugging along like this bass line, notice how if I have that pre-delay like really long, it starts to futz with the timing of everything. So let's go from 0 and then we'll go up slowly and you'll notice how it changes. So as you move up towards past 50 milliseconds, you get more of like a slapback delay. It's like, you know, you have to clap in a valley and then a second later you hear your clap. That's pretty much what the pre-delay does. Now, it's really important that like if I were to, I'm going to show you how I would match this pre-delay to the sound that's playing, just based off my ears. Like where it's at right now actually sounds pretty cool. As like an individual effect, it could sound very cool. But if it's with this kick, which needs work, but if it was with this kick, so what starts to happen is as you move down towards 0 milliseconds, that reverb is going to line up perfectly with the sound of the bass. You're going to get more phasing. So typically like the safest range for pre-delay, the safest pre-delay range for basses, for me, I've always felt is around 10 to 20 milliseconds. That's just a range I like. It gives it a nice kind of room feel. Doesn't always work. Sometimes you need to have it closer. But that's the range that I like the most. So let's listen to that. All right, cool. So moving on. On to the next most important one is your decay, which we just explained, as you know. If we wanted to make this room sound bigger, we just make the decay super long, and it's just gonna fuck with our bass, by the way. So you can lengthen the bass within reason on sounds that sustain and that are evolving like that. But the longer eventually you get so long, it just becomes this wish-wash. It doesn't work. But typically with basses like that, because you have a mix going around them, the bass is really, you don't need it to create that back space. You don't need that long tail. You could better accomplish that with just a very light send to a long tail reverb if you wanted to really do that, to just blend it with your mix a little better. But on a simple level, I would keep the decay very short on a bass like this. And I would turn the mix down. Because you really want to emphasize the bass, the sound of the bass itself. The sound design on the bass itself should really accomplish as much as possible in terms of like giving an aggressive mid-rangey bass. Then you can kind of just give it more space with some Valhalla Room. Like that. All right, cool. So moving on, you have high cut. Now, high cut relates to your delay in that high cut also determines how far back your bass is perceived. Now, if you have a bass like this and you want to make it sound like the bass is a little bit further away without having to increase the decay, you can accomplish a little bit of that by bringing your high cut down. So let's notice how that changes the kind of placement of the bass. As we pull this high cut down, it's going to cut away the high frequencies of the bass. Well, it didn't do, see, this is one of those idiosyncrasies of reverbs. It doesn't actually place it further in the back. What it does do is it makes the bass sound tighter because it gets rid of those high frequencies that the bass just doesn't need. It actually sounded really good around 5K. 3K actually. right? So the next one is a little bit of an esoteric control for some people. It's the depth control. All this does is the depth determines whether Valhalla Room is relying on an early reflections-based format to create the space or a late reflections balanced format to determine the size of the space. What that means is that if you have the depth all the way up, the sound is going to rely on this late page is going to be the main sound that you get from Valhalla Room. If you turn it all the way down, the main sound that you get is from the early page of Valhalla. So I'll show you what that means. We'll start with the early page, right? We'll leave it at 0, and now we're just going to go through the early page, and we'll show you all the parameters there, and then somewhere in there we'll figure out how to show you how the depth, changes the balance between the early and the late page. So starting with the early page, let's listen to actually Valhalla as we pull the depth from the top down, and then we'll try to bring it full circle. So you'll notice how the reverb sounds a lot closer. And that's because it's relying on these parameters here. Now, the early size parameter is one of the most interesting parameters of Valhalla because it's a parameter that does two things, that does the job of two parameters that most reverbs tend to have, which is attack and decay, or attack and release, or attack and decay, yeah. But it does it for just the early reflections. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you the early reflections and what those are. So what we do to hear the early reflections of Valhalla Ubermod is we turn early send down, turn diffusion down. Actually, early send has nothing to do with that. Just turn diffusion all the way down. This way you're going to hear all the individual reflections that are designed to give you the early space of Valhalla. And to hear it better, we'll turn the mix knob all the way up. And I'll turn diffusion up and down, and you'll hear how the reflections sound like delays at first, and then they sound very wishy-washy, very washed at first, and then they kind of sound more individual. That's what diffusion does. It makes it more diffuse. I can't even tell the difference. That's hard for me to hear. So maybe what we do is we'll come back to that later. We'll look at early size. So what early size does is, like I said, it's a really interesting parameter. It basically is how long it takes for the early energy of Valhalla Ubermod, Valhalla Room. It's how long it takes for it to build up so that you can hear it. So if I turn this up and I turn this all the way to like 800, you'll notice how it takes forever for it to build up. If I turn it down, it becomes super tight. Early size is like a mixture, but it's like a mix of pre-delay, decay, and something else, but for just the early reflections. So as you turn it all the way up, they get more delay and whatnot. And so once it's up high enough, we can actually turn diffusion off, and you'll hear how that changes the sound. You hear how you get the effect when you turn the diffusion down. That's those individual reflections. Now, early cross is a really interesting one. It does barely anything that I can detect, so I don't really care too much about it. It's a control that I generally skip over. And from time to time, I just like twist it one way and not the other, and I think I know what I'm doing, but really I don't. So my understanding of it is it's like the stereo spread of those early reflections. So if we turn diffusion down, listen as I adjust this, something might change, something might not, I don't know. Yeah, my guess is it's just like a stereo thing, but for me it's so subtle I give two craps about it. It's not a very important control. What is, though, are the mod rate and depth. This is pretty much the pitch modulation of your early reflections. And the mod rate is how fast it's happening. The depth is how much the pitch is going up and down. So let's check that out now. And the way I like to show this to people is I turn the mod depth all the way up, and then I gradually turn the rate. And you'll hear how it just wreaks havoc on the pitch of those early reflections. that again with a shorter early size, because these all kind of interact in weird ways. Pretty cool. All right, so moving on to our late part of the reverb. Now, the late section doesn't do anything if your depth is all the way at 0. You don't hear anything about the late section. And what's interesting about the early section is this early send. This is one of these counterintuitive things. The early send, if you were to turn the depth up towards 100, the early send would tell Valhalla how much of that early reverb that we hear right now, it'll tell Valhalla how much of that to send to the second stage of Valhalla, which is the late stage. How much of it is going to be sent into that, and then the late stage, you can control the size of it with the size knob. So let's check this out. Right, we'll just gradually turn the wetness up, or the depth up from 0 to 100 first. And then once we get to 100, we'll adjust the size, and you'll see how that changes the size of Valhalla Room. It's one of the other main controls as well. They're all main controls. Hooray! Notice how that creates a bigger room. It also creates more of a delay effect in there. The bigger the room is, the more that you hear that delay. Tighter room. So check this out. We'll put it up at like 50. Watch what happens when I turn that early send up. Pretty hard to tell. It's pretty hard to tell what's going on there, but I'll give you a dramatic example so you know what's going on. It's the best way to learn every tool, so use a dramatic example. So what we'll do is we'll take our early size, and as you remember, that creates like this very wishy-washy delay effect. That's what the early size does. Instead of, it's tight, so get this big delay. And then we'll turn the depth all the way up. And what we'll do is, so notice our early send is at 0. Watch what happens as I turn it up. Watch what happens to the late room. So really what's happening there is if you have this setup right here, when you turn the depth up more towards 100, this early send, if you turn that up as well, says how much of the early size sound that you get, the early reflections, how much of those get sent to the late stage of the reverb, which is more resonant, it's fuller. And so you can create a very kind of epic delay by using a balance between this early send and the late room. And a pretty common setting I find myself doing is like 100 depth, and let's just fool around, I'll show you. So it's interesting how you have to balance those out. And, I'm just so used to it that I know how they kind of work together. But the general idea when I'm configuring the synth is I always get my early size figured out first, because it's a large determinant of how that reverb room is perceived in terms of size. Then you do the finishing touches with late size. Now, if you don't know what you're doing, I'd keep late size at like 50, which I think is the default. And then you just kind of configure your early size into it. And that's one of those kind of counterintuitive things. And so again, with the late room, you also have a modulation control, which controls how wishy-washy it sounds. So we'll listen to that. I'll show you how that sounds again. Now you're not going to hear it as much because the late stage, what the late stage really is it's the length of your decay. If I turn the decay down to like 10, you're not going to hear the changes I make to the late room as much. Unless, of course, you turn the late size down. Again, everything's related in this thing. He tried to simplify it, and he did, and it's the most elegantly put together reverb. I'm sure there's 100 different ways you can understand it. This is just how I do it. So if we turn that decay all the way up, notice what happens with that mod rate. You're really going to hear that because this is at full mod rate with full mod depth. It choruses the hell out of that reverb, right? And so if we turn the mod depth down, we get a less kind of washy reverb. And really the final stage of Valhalla Room is basically an EQ. It's the balance that you want this to have. I don't always do it this way, but it's definitely something I'm aware of that I almost always tweak it to some degree. I tweak it fairly often. So what you can do is you can control like the balance of the lows to the highs. That's how I think of it. How long do I want the lows in my reverb, and how long do I want the highs to kind of taper in our reverb? So typically with basses, I want the reverb to be like pretty tight. I don't want it to add low end energy that's just going to muddy up my bass. It's going to sound like shit. So I'm almost always just leave this at like 1K ish or 800, and I just subtract a little bit. And let's watch how that tightens it up. Let's go back to 1. And then the high multiplier is basically like a shelving filter. That's how I think of it. And then, I'd set that at like 5K. If I want it to be like a little bit darker and this hasn't worked, I just subtract some more, up like that. Hear how it got darker when I put down to 0.10. And yeah, that's pretty much it. I mean, after that you have the reverb modes. These are just different reverb algorithms. I can't explain them. You have to hear them. So we'll just cycle through them, and then, you can hear how that changes the original sound. So there's a lot of different tones to work with. If I'm being honest, the tones I use the most are like large room and bright room, dark chamber, and narcissus. Those are the main ones I use. Dark chamber and dark space are automatically have more chorusing on them, so they're going to sound more wishy-washy. Narcissus is great on pianos. Large room and bright room in particular, sounds fantastic on basses. It sounds fantastic on just about anything. It really is like this. Honestly, this is a powerful reverb, and it's so versatile. The things you can do with it. It sounds great on drums, and yeah, I try to give you guys a quick tutorial on that. And the truth is, reverbs would probably require like a good 4 hours of videos to really like get it down, to like actually create like a systematic. I'll probably do that. If you guys are interested, I'll probably create like a systematic series, a system that simplifies, Valhalla Room, because I am at the point where I don't look at it the way that I explained it necessarily. Like pretty much when I open it, my eyes focus on like 3 parameters or 4 parameters at most, and it's usually just the mix. If I have it on a separate track, it's the decay, the high cut, and then early size and late size. Everything else happens after. I just tweak the other stuff after the fact. Anyway, so, if you guys have any more questions, let me know. Reverb's a pretty deep thing. I would suggest if you still find it a little bit kind of peculiar to you, you just Google some resources. You'll find guys who make that stuff. And if you're looking for a reverb, I strongly suggest Valhalla Room. It is the best reverb there is. It is extremely low on CPU usage. It's insanely cheap. It's $50, And for a reverb like this, that is a steal. I mean, this reverb right here, this SAR or whatever, I paid $250 or $200 for it. I almost never use it. It's a great reverb for a very specific job, but like vocals, and that's about it. Like seriously, like the things that I would use that reverb for, almost always using Valhalla. Anyway, I can't praise it enough. I don't have an affiliate link beneath. I probably should, but I don't. So I'll have to just go to that guy's website. His name's Sean Costello. He's a great developer. He does a lot of subcontracting for other developers in the VST industry because he's that awesome. And he has some pretty cool things to say about reverb. I would suggest checking out his website, valhalladsp.com. And, hopefully that's something that you're going to use in your mixes. If you have any questions, leave them. And if you haven't subscribed to my channel yet, please, take your paw, take your finger, take your foot. I don't care, whatever you use to interface. Just, subscribe to that channel. Or you can just wait. And, everybody's got their ways of doing things. And see you guys around.